Continued to piece the story
Right.
together. Harvard would say there's no way that she could prove that her rentee is our rentee,
Right.
meaning my ancestor,
Mhm.
and they're laying claim to him.
Mhm.
That there's no way that I could prove that. And every time I heard that, it motivated me more.
I bet it did.
You know, it drove me more. It forced me to look harder, to dig deeper,
Mhm.
to search further.
Mhm.
And what the beauty of this story is all of the angels who, when they learned this story,
Mhm.
they came to me and said, you know, this is terrible. What can I do to
Yeah.
help?
Right.
And you know, in my book, chapter after chapter is
Mhm.
about people who learn about Harvard's complicity in
Mhm.
slavery,
Mhm.
and their you know, refusal
Yes.
to acknowledge Rentee's rich oral history,
Mhm.
and give him the dignity
Right.
of his family
Right.
and his family name.
Right.
And so people, you know, joined in, originally reached help. I had some assistance from the Connecticut genealogy, Connecticut Historical Society. They helped me with the genealogy.
Mhm.
I'm on social media sites
Mhm.
looking for information. I find this amazing woman by the name of Rose Shiver.
Mhm.
Rose lives in Columbia, South Carolina. But during the research, I knew that in order for me to find where ultimately my enslaved ancestors landed, I had to find the descendants of the enslaver.
Yes.
Because my family, my ancestors weren't sold, they were given away as gifts.
Mhm.
And throughout the genealogy and the research, there is so much that is inhumane about that process.
Mhm.
And I often talk about the different experience that Black people encounter when they're doing this work,
Yeah.
versus people that aren't descendants of American chattel slavery.
Mhm.
I do it out of a sense of longing or belonging, or the need to piece my family back together. And many people who do this work, you know, some do it out of curiosity,
Mhm.
but when you know the history and you know how violently your
Yeah.
family was ripped apart, it's not a labor of love. It's really a labor. It's labor intensive, and it's emotional, because as I'm going down the slave indexes that I find, sorting through my family, I have to sort out cows and pig and other chattel.
Oh wow. Yeah.
And so I remember the night when I was reading, and there they are mixed in with livestock.
Livestock. Right.
I'm like, you know, I just lamented for my ancestors, because to be reduced to livestock, what that must have felt like for them, and the inhumanity of that. And so, you know, my daughter made an interesting, she put it very interestingly when she said, you know, I see and I have seen pictures of enslaved people. But it's different when you see them and know that they're your ancestors, that they're your
You're
blood.
connected to them.
You're connected.
There's that connection.
And it's a hurt and a despair that is so different. I mean, you look at slavery and understand the evilness of the institution, but when you look at it from and you're looking in the eyes of your loved one
Within your DNA.
yes, it's a hurt that's hard to describe.
It is.
Yes. And so, you know, and I often say, you know, some, you know, particularly like I said, for people who aren't descendants of American chattel slavery, this is, you know, just something to do. You know, and you know, they enjoy doing it. It's fun, but you know, it is for particularly Black people who know their old history and know who they're looking for. It's trauma.
Yeah.
It's trauma.
And then, you know, listen to you say you're going through the book. And were there names, or were there just like property belong in a description? Were there, because I mean, we didn't have any identity.
No, and that is, you know, the other reality when I talk about, again, the invisibility of the Black race at that point. The enslaved people, they weren't given birth certificates. When they died, they weren't. The record of their death wasn't recorded. And when they're buried, if you ever visit an enslaved cemetery
Mhm.
or an Afro-American, a historic Afro-American cemetery
Mhm.
where enslaved people are buried, the disrepair and the just the wasteland.
Yeah.
And I did visit where my enslaved ancestors were buried, and I had to walk away because it was emotional, because I thought about these enslaved people
Mhm.
who who were born
Right.
into servitude,
Right.
who lived their entire life as an enslaved person, who built the South.
Right.
And when they were born, there was no record of their birth. When they died, there was no record of their death. And when they buried them, it's almost like they disposed of them
Yeah.
and threw them away. There's no headstones, there's no markers.
Right.
And the one thing that I saw, and it literally broke my heart, when the person who was there, who was familiar with that cemetery in South Carolina, he said, what you see are all of these yucca plants. And he said, they bloom beautifully in the spring.
Mhm.
They look kind of like cactusy.
Yeah, they're succulents,
yes,
aren't they? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so he said, what enslaved people would do would use those as headstones to mark
Yeah, to mark.
the final resting place of their loved one. And it just touched me in a way that I just, it literally almost brought me to tears, because I saw a sea of yucca plants all over the place.
Wow.
And it was just like the irony of, these people who had done so much to build the South were literally invisible. And
to build a nation.
to build a nation.
To build a nation.
And it's almost an erasure of culture.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the evils of slavery and how disenfranchised Black people and their descendants are, you really have to start with the intentional act to make us invisible, as if we didn't exist. And that was intentional, and it was something that extended beyond slavery.
Right.
My mother, who she was born in 1926, she didn't get a birth certificate until 1970.
Really?
Yes, and so I didn't think about that and put it into the context until I looked at the larger piece of what was happening about the disenfranchising of Black life, to disinherit, to disqualify, to eliminate, to erase. And so if you don't give them the dignity of a recorded date of birth and death, when they're gone, they didn't exist.
They didn't exist. They're gone.
They're gone.
But I listen to you and I think, because we always talk about our ancestors. That's who we are. We indigenous folk. We talk about our ancestors, and the drive of that. Calling out to you.
Yes, and the first chapter of the book is entitled Sankofa.
Yeah.
And I talk about the meaning of the past reaching out to the present, and I kind of put my own little spin on that, and where I said that I can't move forward until I go back and recover the cultural property of my enslaved ancestors. And so the battle began. The struggle with Harvard began. And I, when I would reach out, they would dismiss. But other people who heard the story were like just over the moon excited about not only the historicness of it. Some people said, this is like a missing link in history. So many have wondered who this enslaved person is, and here you have a descendant who knows. And who knows his rich.
But think of the precedence on that, because if there's that one or two from Papa and his daughter, think about all the hundreds or thousands more that exist, and and you're recovering that. You're starting that process.
And that, brings us to the legal piece of this. Because I go on for years trying to open a dialogue with Harvard about the daguerreotypes and how they would and should restore Rinty's dignity. And what I learned was he was at the Peabody Museum. And the School of Comparative Anatomy, I can't say.
That's okay.
And zoology. Anatomy
and zoology.
And so, I'm thinking, literally you have my ancestor
Mm-hmm.
in a zoo.
Mm.
And so, I learn, as I'm doing the research and finding things and
Mhm.
finding documents that definitively link me to
Mhm.
the man in the image, and other people are telling the story. I learned that Harvard is also in the process of telling a story about my enslaved ancestors. When I made this discovery,
Mhm.
they were in the process of publishing this big book.
Yeah.
And they had reached out to scholars and historians all over the world,
Yeah.
to come together to define
Mhm.
my ancestors and to trace their legacy,
Mhm.
and tell the story of who they were.
Mhm.
So they were working on this, and lo and behold, I pop up with a whole different narrative.
Mhm.
So immediately I had to go away,
Right.
because I could not sabotage their efforts
Yeah.
to put this big book together that they had been working
So again,
on.
it's a business.
It's all about money.
It's a business.
Always
Yes.
been, and it always will. Yes. And they commission people to do the research on who these enslaved people
Mhm.
are, and published a book.
Mhm.
And they actually published a book after I had filed the lawsuit.
Mm.
And I determined, after reaching out to them and being brushed off and being discarded and
Mhm.
being pushed aside, I happened to attend a conference where Attorney Ben Crump was speaking.
Mhm.
And there were hundreds of people, an auditorium full
Yeah.
of people.
Yeah.
And I was thinking in that moment, I said, I need someone who has the courage to challenge Harvard
Right.
head on.
Right.
Many people, particularly here in the North, Harvard's influence is far-reaching.
Yes.
And they have literally shut down stories where reporters were going to write about this story, and they told them not to, and they killed the story.
Mm.
So they were catching and killing news stories, and they were doing. And I said, I need someone who's not going to be afraid to challenge Harvard.
Mhm.
And I made my way through the crowd, and I was waving through and making my way to the front of the stage. And I finally reached the front of the stage, and I had a business card that I had created with an image of Rinty on it, and I gave it to him. And I said, this is my enslaved ancestor. And I said, he's currently in Harvard's Peabody Museum. And, I'm in this battle with them in terms of his cultural property. And he said, very interesting. And I said, I believe that this is an important reparations case. And we exchanged information. And, I actually had to speak quickly because everybody was around him, and we were taking a selfie. And he was very, very pleasant. And I just thought he was just being pleasant and pleasantly sending me along, dismissing me. But a few days later, he called and he said, Miss Lanier, I haven't been able to think about anything other than, he was, I gave him that image of Rinty. And there's one thing about that, I call it the power of Papa Rinty, to move people and to capture people's attention and imagination. When you look at that death-defying stare,
Right.
it moves people. And he was so touched by that. He said, I haven't been able to think about anything else.
It is powerful. I've seen that photo. It's very, and that stare, you don't forget that.
You don't.
That is there. It's engraved in my head.
The defiance, the opposition, I am a man despite
Absolutely.
what you do to me.
Absolutely.
You will not take my humanity. And, and he didn't have to say a word. I mean, it was
there
in his face, yes. But, so Attorney Crump, we met, I showed him all my research. He actually had an opportunity to be in the film Marshall, Thurgood Marshall's biopic.
Yes.
And it turns out that Attorney Michael Koskoff was the writer for that screenplay. And they're on a Hollywood set filming Marshall. And Ben is telling Mike about this case in Harvard, and Mike falls in love with the story. And so that is what I call the making of my dream team, because they come together and they, again, two powerhouses. The Koskoff firm has represented the Sandy Hook victims. Sued Remington for their responsibility for all the of arms.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So they're not intimidated by a big Harvard. And so Mike, he really framed it perfectly when he said, we're going to put together a complaint that's going to rock Harvard back on its heels. And it, the complaint, if it is online, I would encourage anybody to take a look at it. It is being taught in a number of law schools, particularly Yale.
Yes, of course, absolutely.
And a number of others. I've heard from many people who are teaching just the complaint itself because it opens so many legal questions that have not been wrestled with here in the United States. And what I like to remind people is many reparations lawsuits have been brought in the past, and they all have been dismissed from the door for lack of standing.
There's no precedence.
There's no
precedence.
And it is hard to firstly say that I can prove that I'm a descendant of an a specific enslaved person who has property that is so valuable that it's priceless. And because slaves couldn't own property.
No.
So there is no precedent for this. But I have the standing because I can say I am this man's descendant and I'm bringing this action on his behalf. And all the other cases have been dismissed because of standing is hard, a difficult threshold. Even the Tulsa, the victims there. Those cases have all been dismissed. This is the first and only case that has survived the motion to dismiss, and the judge has ruled it will go to a jury decision. And so, as unique as that is, you would think, because, and I encourage people, again, on the internet, you'll find a lot of this information.
Right.
Harvard's argument, to many, makes no sense. Harvard, when we filed the complaint, they filed the motion to dismiss. They said that a photo, irrespective of the criminality involved, the nudity involved, the coercion involved, always belongs to the photographer, that it's settled law, and that's why they get to keep the daguerreotypes, the images of my enslaved ancestors. And so what our attorneys pointed out was, when Harvard commissioned these daguerreotypes, they did so at a time when it was illegal to do.
Right.
The state of Massachusetts in 1786 or 83, in the Mumet case, abolished slavery and said it was inconsistent with their constitution. And so when Harvard did this act, it was an illegal act. So these daguerreotypes are the images that
were collected illegally. They're illegally collected.
And so, I often say that in the whole history of jurisprudence, never is it that a court should say that you have to allow the person who did wrong, the wrongdoer, to keep the proceeds of their crime.
Right, exactly.
In my attorneys, in their legal terminologies, in their best legalese, they said Harvard is a tortfeasor, and that reparations flow from the tortfeasor to the victim, and not the other way around. And so, we thought we had sound in good standing here, and the judge sided with Harvard in his decision. He basically regurgitated everything Harvard said. It made no sense to me. But we appealed to the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, and the case was heard there. And again, Harvard's argument was the same. And now we have amici briefs. We have briefs from Harvard law students. We have briefs from Harvard is saying these are Agassiz, the scientists. We have the scientist family coming forward saying, give it back, give these back. That we got a brief from them. We had a brief from a German attorney from Germany. We had a brief from a curator of a museum who was an Oxford University in Britain professor, Professor Dan Hicks. And so we had briefs from all over the world come in support of our case. But the one that I thought was most powerful was from a Harvard student by the name of Jared Martin Drake. He talked about the notion of provenance, and this is a term used for museums. They're gifted artifacts and all kinds of things, but what they have to do is show that they have good title to firstly receive
Right,
that
exactly.
the person
The title,
has,
yes, exactly.
yes, like
Yes,
title
like a
search.
car,
Yeah,
a title car,
exactly.
yeah.
And so, he, in his brief, he gave his impeccable credentials. And he said, unless these documents are hiding in plain sight, they're simply not there. Harvard does not have a good title to these daguerreotypes. They have no title to this daguerreotype.
Right.
And he entitled it, he said, he captioned his brief, Harvard Archives bear strange fruit. There's blood on the leaves.
Right.
And he talked about the fact that there's just an absence of titles and paperwork.
Right, exactly.
And much of what Harvard was curating.
Yeah.
And so, when we went before the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, the justices questioned Harvard over and over again. What is your property interest in it, and how can you prove that it's superior to mine? Harvard wouldn't answer it. Harvard just basically said, their property interest doesn't matter. What matters is that I don't inherit a property interest from a photo because it belongs to the photographer. Keep in mind, Harvard was not the photographer.
No, in the photographer's family, his descendants are saying this belongs to the family. Give it back to them.
So I left the court feeling pretty good because each of the justices, they let Attorney Crump speak uninterrupted. Attorney Koskoff spoke uninterrupted. The Harvard attorney could not get a word out before they all pounced
right on him. Yeah.
Basically, they were saying your arguments don't
wash. Yeah.
And they called the Harvard, they referred to Harvard as the joint tortfeasor, the employer of the wrongdoer. All of these legal terms that suggest that they are seeing Harvard as the wrongdoer. Right. So I'm like, well, they can't give the daguerreotypes back to Harvard. And so in their ruling, it took 8 months for them to rule. And their decision was that my case would proceed. Yeah. They also decided that I could go back and enlarge my complaint to include a claim of reckless, outrageous, and negligent infliction of emotional distress, not only for me, but for my enslaved ancestors. Yes. So my attorneys, they were like, we've never seen this kind of language before. This is, the 91-page decision was so indicting of Harvard. And it, we weren't asking for it. They said, go back, claim it. Right. And so, but what they also said is Harvard could keep the daguerreotypes. So I was floored. And they were like, my attorneys were trying to put a positive spin on it. And they were looking at the language and saying, they've really pigeonholed Harvard here because they basically are saying anything you do with these images that I view or feel offended by is another cause of action. So Harvard has to tread very lightly and lightly with these daguerreotypes. Right. And, now, because the one thing is, if I were to prevail and actually get ownership of the daguerreotypes, anyone related to me could then have a cause of action against me. So here they took that off the table and they said, you are pursuing for the emotional distress piece. And so I remember thinking, I get how this really is in my best interest, but I feel like I'm leaving a loved one behind. And it's just, and I said in that moment, I said, irregardless of what happens, I vow to never stop naming, blaming, and shaming Harvard until they relinquish the daguerreotypes. They will never have a moment's peace with them until they give them up. Right. And so the case is now pending in the Middlesex Superior Court. We are moving forward. The attorneys, every now and then, they take a beat to say, let's talk, and we move forward. So it's right.
So this story is powerful because as I stated earlier, it's setting a precedence. It has set huge precedences. And definitely how long do you think it's going to just estimate take for them to reach some decision moving forward?
If we do not settle, I figure we would perhaps be in trial by maybe April or May. We've done a lot of work, the discovery, and I learned a lot. Yeah. And you know what
Yeah.
Harvard has done now, they have filed a motion about confidentiality
Uh-huh.
because keeping this out of the
Well,
headlines.
isn't that ironic?
Exactly. It works to their advantage because they don't want people to know their dark history,
Yeah.
the ugliness of
Yeah.
how they've conducted themselves. Not necessarily just in 1850,
Mm-hmm.
but in 2010,
But present day.
2015,
Present day.
2025.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so it hasn't changed. And their conduct hasn't
Yeah.
changed.
Yeah.
And they have been really, I call them
Yeah.
the framers
Mm-hmm.
of you know, not only scientific racism but racism. They use their
Yeah.
academic prowess to
Yeah.
come in, put their thumb on the scale, and I like to say poison the imagination of people, and to use these images.
Yeah.
And
They muddy the water.
Yes.
It's like, oh, let's just
Yes.
throw this in there
Yes.
and say, oh, but no, this belonged to that one and this
Yeah.
one, and
Yeah.
we've got, but we're innocent in all of this.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to, again, I think to what we said at the beginning of this, seeing the humanity
Yes.
of the person sitting across from you or in the picture.
Exactly.
Seeing the humanity of the person in the picture. So I would love, once they reach a decision, would you be more than willing to come back
Absolutely.
and
I will
talk
be
about
ready
this
to
some
shout it
more?
from-
Yes, this is going to be really exciting.
Yeah.
The energy, I do believe, is leaning in your favor.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm so thrilled that you were able to get here because I know you've been very busy.
Busy, very, very busy.
You've been
It's
very busy.
busy. I've been
Yes.
traveling with the book. I'm very excited about that.
Yeah.
And there's so much in there.
Yeah.
There.
I'm going to put this up. I'm going to put it up on our hub from these roots and where students or just the general public can purchase this.
Yes. Yes.
And so this is a story that has to be told, and I'm even trying to see if I can get you over to Mitchell's library.
Great.
I have been speaking to them as well to have you in and just have you speak to the students.
Yeah. And again, because Harvard likes this silence.
Yeah.
And,
Right.
The more people that know,
Definitely.
it shames them.
Definitely.
Into
Yes,
doing
it
the right
does.
thing.
It does. Well, again, thank you so much. You are such a blessing to so many. Your family, Papa Renty.
Yes.
Papa Renty.
Yeah. And I get emotional because I think about my mother, and
Yes.
I just wish that she
Yes.
had firstly lived to see the image, to know the man that she lived her whole life hearing
Right.
about,
Right.
and then to see that she approves of the fight that we've waged against Harvard.
Yeah.
And I do believe, she's up in heaven looking down, and she's approving, and she knows. But I lament sometimes is if she just lived a little longer.
Yeah. But she's living through you.
She,
Our ancestors lived through us. We stand on their shoulders.
We do.
She gave you got that modeling from her, the fight that you have, the fight that your babies see, your daughters see, that what they see you, it lives on, it goes on, and you're keeping that alive. You are. So again, thank you. I look forward to having you back, and hopefully over to Mitchell's library as well.
I'd love to.
Beautiful, thank you. And so we're going to sign off. Mitchell College, thank you again, Radio Mitchell. We will be back. The coach will be back with me in 2 weeks. And I'm thinking that will be the 27th, 2 Thursdays from now. And we look forward to bringing you our last episode for Black History Month, which we know Black History is every day. But Ananda will be having her Letting Our Voices Be Heard on, I want to say it's